I just want to make comments that actually doesn't really depend on the underlying quality of the company. For example, Facebook is a very high quality company, but clearly it overdone its IPO, and it didn't succeed with its IPO. I don't know why it happened, but generally IPO is just one business process in your business. As a part of any fundraising, you need to execute it well, but focusing on it is really wrong. And you have to understand that I deal with probably on a daily basis with about 60 companies in my various stages of portfolio, and there are various sizes. Unfortunately, very large percentage of founders and professional managers especially believe that IPO is sort of the main goal of the business. The main goal of the business is to grow the business.
I would like to change direction for just a few minutes and talk about mergers and acquisitions as an alternative form of creating liquidity for the company. And again, being the devil's advocate for a little bit, from my experience, there have been a lot of acquisitions, large and small. Most of them have failed. The acquiring company has brought the talent in. They couldn't retain the talent. It was hard to merge the technologies. There were a lot of issues merging the teams. And a few years later, the money was not well spent. Do you feel that there is a right and a wrong way to create acquisitions? Do you feel acquisition for the acquiring company makes sense?
I'll start. I mean, I think obviously we've seen large acquisitions this year with Tumblr being acquired by Yahoo. But we do watch these stats pretty closely because I care about public companies, and we are down from last year. This time last year we had about 90 companies on NASDAQ that were acquired. This year we're up to about 50. And I think that has to do with the high valuations. There's not many companies I talk to that are not close to the 52-week high. So with the market being so strong, I think a lot of the companies are pretty much at a premium today. So I think you've seen less M&A activity than you have in the past. And I think the IPOs, because the IPOs are having great returns and great valuations, they're also taking the route of an IPO versus M&A. So I think the market dynamics have changed dramatically over the last 12 months.
Yeah, I think in this technology business, the further the time goes, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, now, there's a lot of questions which are sort of like average temperature in the hospital. So are the M&A bad or are they good? Unfortunately, it's highly dependent on the specific situation in which your company is and whom you're acquiring. And it's highly dependent on how you do it. Indeed, in a lot of cases, the acquisitions are only thought through very, very initial stage, and they are not sort of thought through for a very long time. What I've noticed, and I don't have the statistics, I think you in NASDAQ and the stock exchange have much more statistics on this, is that more and more companies are starting to use a little bit different process. They acquire a company and keep it separate for a while. Like, for example, Skype at Microsoft, which is like, it basically run as a separate, I think it's still a separate business unit, like VMware at AMC or Tumblr and Yahoo. And that process is relatively safe. Integrating companies is really difficult. I've acquired, say, a dozen or maybe about 15 companies into my companies over time, and a lot of them indeed failed because it's a difficult process. It's much more difficult than it looks. It's sort of like at some point there was a competing series in biology. One was DNA related, genomics, and another one was related in growing different fruits and vegetables by putting another fruit into it. I don't know how to translate it, but you can take one apple and just put a small thing into that apple from another apple and grow another fruit. Unfortunately, that doesn't go very far. This species have to be very related for this to work.
I spend 90% of my time on this topic, and I think the good news is I'm certainly working with Israeli companies that are very successful in M&A and that are using it very positively. It is a very hard process, and it's a process where many managers don't have a core competency in it. Their core competency is R&D, is sales and marketing, is many other things. It's not acquiring and integrating companies. I think the most important things to bear in mind for successful companies are, one, at the end of the day, it's all about people. If people have a clear vision on where the company is going and they know that their future is certain, they're motivated, they're retained, they're locked in, mergers generally work. It's when there's uncertainty, which is not answered by management, that you have unsuccessful mergers. On the topic of whether to leave the company separate or not, again, it can be very successful if it's a deliberate strategy which is communicated and where employees trust that that is the answer. There's one merger which is happening now where the press release issued said something like, we are keeping this Israeli business as a separate entity for now. Those two words, for now, send unbelievable uncertainty and confusion into the eyes of employees, and my guess would be those two words can cause significant attrition in a company. So whatever integration strategy you choose, whether that's a full transformation or just a bolt-on standalone, if you execute it well, you communicate it well, you ring fence it so the business can focus on growth and people are retained and have certainty over their future, I believe M&A can be very successful. If you don't do all of those things, it can be a disaster.
I agree with all you have said. My experience is more more with companies that went public, but I agree with everything you have said.
So I have to say I'm excellent. I take the contrarian view sometimes, but I do agree it's a mixed bag that when managed correctly, mergers can make sense. I think IPOs can make sense. I think both have advantages and disadvantages. Personally, having been acquired by Cisco a few times, Cisco is a very efficient acquisition machine. It leverages those acquisitions fairly well. They have a religion of integrating the team and the team spirit into the company. So it would make sense sometimes to keep an entity separate. In some cases, for a little bit, they did it, like at the WebEx acquisitions. But typically, they want to make sure that there is a cultural fit. They want to make sure that as they bring those companies in, they can leverage them on a larger scale than just their independent business. But at the same time, a lot of those great ventures get suffocated when they become a part of a bigger company. And I wonder if any of you have any examples, especially related to Israel, of successful mergers or successful IPOs that were sustainable over time.
I just want to give an example of the situation where the culture fit might end up being difficult. Recent Microsoft acquisition of Nokia, those are two companies with a highly different culture, and it would be very interesting to see how they would try to fit, because the companies are managed and staffed by completely different people. So that's a big challenge.
I would have to add that even the Microsoft Skype acquisition is yet to be seen. How that thing works out, because the cultures are very different. Changing topics, and I want to talk a little bit about Israel, since this is a local conference, and get your opinion on whether it makes sense for the state to be involved and promote either creating companies that would get acquired or building companies up to go public.
I think that the importance of the technology sector to Israel is huge. And because of that, the state should promote the companies. And as I'm speaking from my position, I'd like the state to promote companies go public on the exchange. And as I said before, last September, Professor Shmuel Hauser set up a committee to promote investing in traded R&D companies. We all know that the Israeli infrastructure for that, it's it's not so promoting companies. And because of that, the company that was set up the mandate of the company was first to identify the reason why Israeli company doesn't conduct IPOs on the exchanges would be expected from their key role in the market. After doing that, to set up criteria for helping them go public. And lately, the committee has published its interim report, and later I can tell you more about this recommendation that should encourage companies go public and grew here in the Israeli market instead of acquired by foreign companies. Thank you.
Just a couple of words, and I say this not as a consultant, but as an immigrant and Olet to the country. I'm working with Israeli companies that are really starting to get critical mass and to be big companies and to be mature, large Israeli companies. And that clearly is good for the Israeli economy. It's good for attracting immigrants into the country. It's a good thing to encourage the growth and the development of the market. So from my non-governmental position, the more that the state can foster companies to grow and to develop, which includes IPO, which includes M&A, it's a very positive thing for the Israeli market.
Yeah, so I'm not quite as familiar with Israeli market. I'm first time in Israel. I did acquire a company in Israel once into parallel. The company was called Sfera, and I do have investment in the company in Israel from my fund and a company called Cellrox, but my knowledge is limited. In any other place in the world, I would probably think that government should actually stay sort of aside and focus on investing in education, fundamental science and fundamental research, which is extremely important because for technology companies, the most important asset is people, and the best people are produced by long-term fundamental research excellence, not by teaching people to program in Visual Basic or .NET. And that's what would be right for almost any country. I think Israel is sort of unique. It's the only place in the world where government initiatives are actually producing significant outcome. So perhaps in Israel, government can help. Even in Singapore, you know, with my Russian name and Russian accent and my R&D based in Russia, I'm actually a citizen of Singapore. And Singapore publicizes itself as an extremely well-managed country. But even in Singapore, government initiatives related into fostering technology companies are not really super efficient.
Yeah, the only comment I'll make about, I mean, I've been in Israel now for the last couple of days, and as I travel around the world and try to attract listings to NASDAQ, for a while with Sarbanes-Oxley, people were not wanting, outside the U.S., were not wanting to come to the U.S. They thought U.S. had overregulation. That's changed dramatically, and I think because of the ecosystem for investors and analyst coverage that you have in the U.S., we are the most highly sought-after capital market. I do think that Israel needs to be careful not to overregulate. I've heard that consistently in the last couple of days, that the burdens of overregulation are really stymieing some of the companies wanting to list in Israel. So I think there is a concern there that overregulation could dampen the growth of the IPO market here in Israel.
So on this topic, but from a different angle, there is or seems to be some kind of a common agreement that it's good and important for a country like Israel to promote and grow large companies that would go public and then themselves maybe become acquirers of other companies as they grow. And I want to challenge this from two different angles. The first is, I would call this the Yossi Vardi thesis to the extreme. And Yossi's thesis to some extent says what Israel is best at is entrepreneurialism. We have a lot of great people have great ideas. Following them through to create large companies may not be what we do best. Why don't we just promote early stage creation of companies, have them get acquired, and have those entrepreneurs go back and do it again and again and again and become an innovation engine for larger companies outside of Israel, as opposed to try and build those companies ourselves?
Just to be frank, of course, building large companies in Israel is a strange strategy because Israel is a small country, and a company like the large technology company of today employs 100,000 people. And I think in Israel, overall number of people employable by technology company is not super large. And so having a couple of those super large companies might just dry down the market. And so I don't know how it could make sense. I mean, the question is always, could the country produce the company like Microsoft or Oracle or Cisco? And the answer is probably in Israel case, unfortunately not, because simply there is not enough people. Those companies will have to move out at some point because they have to find more people.
Usually the discussion topic was, why isn't there an Israeli Nokia? Which I'm glad to say these days is no longer on the table.
But I do think there's great global companies coming out of Israel. Checkpoint's a great example. Teva, these companies started in Israel. They've become large global companies. And I think there's other companies in other sectors that have also aspired to be like a SodaStream. Caesarstone is a great company that is just opening its first U.S. factory and will be growing globally. So they're great examples of, I think Israeli companies are entrepreneurs. They want to grow great companies, and they want to grow global companies. And I don't think there's anything holding them back from doing that.
Checkpoint was a good story, right? Right now there is a company which is started by Israelis, and it started in U.S. called Palo Alto Networks, which is killing it. And the reason it started in U.S. is actually in order to grow to a huge size, you need that scale. And there wasn't enough scale for Checkpoint. It was a most famous story of, Israeli technology ecosystem, but I think by now there are many other great stories, and this one is kind of dated.
I haven't done the research in detail on the topic, but I would challenge the thesis on the basis that there are a number of very, very competent and skilled managers in the country, as well as R&D professionals. And whether the two are mutually exclusive is a question. I'm working with one company now that's successfully bought 2 R&D centers in different parts of the world and is managing them well through Israeli management. So whether it has to be an exclusive model or whether Israel can mature to be an innovation R&D country which has the maturity to manage businesses as they grow is obviously a question, because I think the fundamental preference of most Israeli entrepreneurs is the first part, but there are good managers in the economy and it shouldn't be forgotten.
So to Sergei's point, just to try and take this a step further, there are great managers in Israel, and some of them have created great companies, but the question is, do we have enough of them, and do we have enough to match the technical talent that we have so that all of them can grow to be large companies? And part of this is I've even heard somebody say there is a form of intellectual colonialism happening where we're being colonialized. The brain power here is being harvested and then sold cheaply in the public markets in the U.S., as opposed to creating large companies here. And to some extent, I want to ask, at the stage that the high-tech industry is this so bad? The colonies created roads, they created legal systems. Do we have enough good managers and marketing people and visionaries to really create large companies that can go public? Or is it really more, every time a company gets acquired, more people go through the training process of working for large corporations in the US and then come out with the abilities to grow more companies? I don't know if you have a take on this.